You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
What a lot of people do not realize when they listen to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour is that so far all of the guests that we've had on the program are subscribers to the Dixie Heritage newsletter. And so it never ceases to amaze me from week to week the really neat and interesting people who subscribe to our newsletter. Of course, sooner or later we will exhaust the, I guess you could say, interesting people who subscribe to our newsletter who we could interview on the radio. And when that day comes, maybe then we'll open it up to people who are not currently subscribers. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who, if I could interview them, I would probably interview them, even though they're not subscribers. But at least for now, believe it or not, all of the people we've interviewed on the Dixie Heritage Hour are subscribers to the Dixie Heritage newsletter. And so again, it's just mind-blowing, all of the neat people who subscribe to the newsletter. And if you're listening and you'd like to know how to subscribe to the Dixie Heritage letter, just go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net, and you can sign up. It's absolutely free, no cost, no obligation. You just give us your email address, and we send it to you every Friday. And our guest this week is no exception, Dr. William Von Peters. He is a physician in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he's one of our subscribers. He is also the president of Confederate States of America, Incorporated, which is an entity that has existed since 1959. At that time, its primary purpose was to be a continuation of the Confederate government that had never surrendered. General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox. He did not surrender the Army of Trans-Mississippi or the Army of Tennessee, nor did he surrender the government at that time. And so there were some, in fact many, who believed that the Confederate government had to continue to exist because it had never lawfully surrendered. But Confederate States of America Incorporated had really stopped serving that function several decades ago. But it continues to function, and it continues to serve as a publisher and a republisher of books from the antebellum era and doing projects to preserve Southern and antebellum heritage and history. And Dr. Von Peters is actively involved in that. He is also a lecturer. He gives frequent lectures annually. He travels and spends several months of the year teaching in Russian universities, teaching in Chinese universities, teaching in other places around the world. And as a result, he has a very unique perspective on some of the things that are going on right now. So in addition to speaking about Confederate heritage and alternative medicine, we also talk about the recent summit between Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump and other issues, as they relate to Russia and so forth. Talk about communism. Just talk about some different Russian-related things. I think that you'll find the conversation is going to be very interesting throughout the course of the entire hour. Dr. Von Peters is just a brilliant mind. He's been a personal friend of mine, for probably the last 10 years or so. And I've even, at one time, seen him as my physician, and he is an excellent physician. And so if you're suffering from some kind of a chronic ailment and you're looking for somebody who you can consult with, kind of outside of the typical MD, let's pump you full of pharmaceuticals mentality, I highly suggest that you contact Dr. Von Peters. And I think that you will find it'll be well worth the time that you take to do so. And of course, for all of the alpha males in our audience, Dr. Von Peters is the epitome of the alpha male, especially he was in his younger years. But he is kind of a role model, if you will, for some of us. And I believe that you'll enjoy the conversation. So let's just go straight to our interview with Dr. William Von Peters.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so what were we going to discuss?
Why don't you start by letting our listeners basically get to know a little bit about who you are. You're a doctor, teach extensively in Russia and China, Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about where you went to school and your practice and, some of the teaching that you're doing overseas?
I'm a doctor of naturopathic medicine, doctor of homeopathic medicine, and degrees in, oriental medicine and so forth. So I've studied, of course, here in the U.S. I've also studied in Australia, China, done degree work in Russia. Kind of eclectic in terms of where all I've studied. I have a herbal degree from Canada. I have some homeopathic degree from England, and so on. So I have a wide variety of modalities that I've studied.
And of course, with the teaching, I know the last time we talked, you were teaching in Russia and in different places. Tell us a little bit about that.
What I've done is basically give lectures and whatnot for medical doctors in Russia. They're not opposed to using natural modalities as most of them are here. Still, when during labor and so forth, even they use natural remedies. There are homeopaths in many of the hospitals. There are osteopaths and so forth, and they're interested in learning more about nutrition, how it works, and all of those things. Some of them are surprised because what we tell them explains some of the problems. For example, I had one woman who was a medical doctor in Russia I was explaining the problems of high calcium in the body, which the MDs are recommending all the women take, which contributes to osteoporosis. And the medical doctor in Russia was saying that they'd never understood why, when they were giving high doses of calcium to their patients, they would get worse instead of better. And so then she understood. So it's a process, but the Russians tend to be more open. Their medical system is built differently than ours over here. It's not as monolithic with the MDs controlling everything. There are natural medical associations and so forth in Russia as well for traditional healers.
So explain a little bit, just because now I'm curious, how the Russian medical system is set up.
Well, it's set up primarily with similar, it's based off of, I would say, the French medical system. And they're more open to, what can I say, natural modalities, in there, because they don't believe that medicine per se, drugs, are the be-all, end-all that they are here. Even in cardiology, Russian cardiology, it's only been fairly recently that the American and European drug companies have been pushing heavily into using pharmaceuticals rather than using, diet, nutrition to control cardiology problems, as well as surgery is being pushed more now as well. But American doctor would probably say they were, more backward because they don't do what we do. But they do a lot of other things, for example, instead of sterilizing with chemicals and everything, getting all of the high germ levels and stuff that they become germ resistant to what they're doing, they use ultraviolet light in their emergency rooms and surgical rooms and so forth, which kill the germ spore more effectively. But they don't need all the chemicals. So it's different in terms of the way they approach things.
So do you think that their medical system is more effective than ours, or do you think it's just different? Or
well, I don't know if it's more effective. I know that they don't have the people since the fall of the Soviet Union. They have been cutting back on medical centers and so on. So it's harder to get access to their care. And in some ways, I would say, yeah, it probably is. There are also other areas, of course, certainly in technology and so forth, that we're farther ahead than they are.
So do they still have a socialized medical system in Russia, or did that go away with the Soviet Union?
Well, it depends kind of on what you're calling socialist medical system. Supposedly, everyone has access to medical care. However, within the last, maybe 5 years, Putin has done what they call optimization, and that has resulted in closing a lot of rural medical centers and making access to actual medical care much more iffy. And so in some ways, the people either can't get it or they're in line now, whereas before there were a lot of doctors and medical centers, and it's just not so now.
It was kind of like what they were saying was going to happen, I guess, with Obamacare. Is that kind of the same principle in play there, that what was going to happen is the more the government had to pay for, the less it was going to become available?
I would say that's true, yeah. The central government in Russia is basically parcels out the funds for the medical care and other systems as well, education and so forth. And so if they are not putting that money out, then of course it shrinks, and centers are closed, schools are closing, libraries are closing. So the people are having a hard time outside of Moscow. The Russian saying is that Moscow is not Russia, because it's kind of like its own little country there that absorbed all the resources of the rest of this huge country.
I know when I was in Cuba, a lot of the pastors told me that. They said that the rest of the country was not like Havana. In Havana the electricity works 24/7, but that's not the case in the rest of the country. And in Havana you could go into a grocery store and buy food. Of course, there were food shortages even in Havana. Sometimes they would have to go to 2 and 3 different grocery stores to get everything on the list. But once you get into the rural areas, you pretty much have to have your own cow if you want to drink milk.
Yeah, I would say it's getting that way pretty much. But what's happened is the central government subsidized the people in the rural areas for long enough so that the ability of the people to raise their own food, get their own milk from their cows and so forth, has been harmed, so that they have kind of lost that over the last 15 years or so. And so they're more dependent upon what the central government can do for them or doesn't do. So even the road system, is which Putin was very good in rebuilding a lot of infrastructure and everything back in the early 2000s. But now that he's rebuilding the military and so on, that the money that used to go to goods and services for the people is being taken to go into building up a bigger military.
Vladimir Putin gets a lot of bad press in this country.
Well, he certainly does.
He seems to me, as I look at all of the leaders on the world stage, he seems to be the only one that is promoting or advocating what I would call traditional Western culture values.
Well, he does. That's certainly true. But the other, there's 2 sides of it, of course. And one is that he is promoting the Orthodox Church, Christianity, and so on. But Russia, you have to remember, is a multi-ethnic empire. It's not really a homogeneous country in the way that we tend to think of them, say, at least in the past, before all the migrants and everything have come into Europe and the individual countries. So they have a lot of inter-ethnic strife, trouble, people pulling for resources, and so on. So he has been working to make Russian the primary language in all the schools, to promote Russian culture, to promote a more Western type approach in many ways, although they also tend to want Russia to stand alone in many ways and not be sucked into the world culture that the multi-globalists were trying to build.
So, do you think that Putin's trying to put the genie back in the bottle?
What genie is that?
The genie of multiculturalism, the genie of we let all these immigrants into our country 100 years ago, the genie of the New World Order, the genie of Bolshevism. We've got a lot of genies we're trying to put back in the bottle in this country, or rather, a very small number of us are trying to put them back in the bottle, and we're failing miserably because we often find out you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
No, you can't. To some extent, do that. The other side of it, though, is that a lot of the multiculturalism, multi-globalism, or globalism per se, and so on, is based on falsehoods. And you have to believe in the illusion that they are promoting in order to really go along with it. In other words, don't believe your lying eyes, believe what we tell you. And that's true, of course, with any this type government. That I'm sure you saw that in Cuba and elsewhere. The government has its own reality that they're pushing, and that's what's happening with the globalists. But with the rise of President Trump, I believe that a lot of the reality-based Americanism is coming back. So it's going to come back, but it may not be what it was in the 1950s and so on, because, there are a different set of problems now than there were then.
Well, I know the president is getting a lot of flack for his recent summit with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, the whole thing is that for many of these globalists and so forth, you need an enemy, so that you can stir the population up and throw a lot of money and everything at it, so they can gain more money, more power, more control, and more influence. And the fact of the matter was that Russia tried very hard to be our friend back in the, after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s and early 2000s and whatnot. And it seemed like, from what I was reading and doing over there as well as here, that every time they tried to be our friend, we'd kick them in the head. George Bush would kick them in the head. And so they got tired of that. So they have become less friendly and less trusting in many ways. And that's not to say that there aren't some problems on their side as well, because there are.
Well, my personal observation, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that Barack Obama basically rebooted the Cold War.
Oh, yeah, I would say that. That's what he was, he took people who were trying to be our friends and made them more so our enemies, especially in the Arab world, trying to overthrow pro-Western leaders and replace them with anti-Western leaders, which he was pretty successful in doing, and that's one reason why the turmoil in the Middle East and Africa and so forth, is continuing to our day. And of course, people there are starving and have no real hope for future, and so they're wanting to come into Western countries, which of course is like overloading a lifeboat, and the lifeboat will sink. Europeans and Americans, if we don't protect what we have, we won't have it anymore.
This is my observation, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it would seem that as far as the New World Order is concerned, and by the New World Order, I'm referring to a conspiracy that goes back at least into the 18th century, if not further back. But the whole goal of a new global order, which the people who are perpetrating it are, let me just say, very patient, because they've taken multiple generations and they're still not as far along in their goals as I think that they would like to be. But I think that one of the keys to their success was the Bolshevism of old Russia. And if they could take over old Russia, then they could take over the rest of Europe. And if they could take over the rest of Europe, then they could take over the world. And we saw, of course, communism take foot and the Soviet Union established, and of course World War I, World War II, basically enabled that Soviet empire to expand and take over much of the European and Asian continents, and of course spread communism into China, into Korea, into Vietnam, Cambodia, other places, as well as even into our hemisphere, Cuba, and in South American countries and so forth. But then the Soviet Union collapsed. And so once the Soviet Union collapsed, the problem became, even though the rest of Europe was becoming more socialist and had formed a European Union, and the rest of Europe was falling in line with the plan, now you have this large mass of people. I believe Russia is 11 times larger than any other country on the planet. That it stretches across like 12 or 13 time zones. I mean, it takes up like 1/5 of the world's land mass. I mean, it's crazy. And all of these are a group of people who now know that communism doesn't work, and they are a force for traditional Western civilization. And it's kind of hard to create your New World Order when that large of a mass of the world that you're trying to conquer is basically going to be your opposition. And so I think that politically it's expedient for these people that the United States and Russia be, if not at real war, at least at Cold War. I think that's the real reason that the president's getting the flack that he's getting. I think that's the real reason Barack Obama rebooted the Cold War. I think that Russia, a non-communist, non-Soviet Russia, scares the bejesus out of the New World Order and the international bankers and so forth.
I wouldn't disagree with that overall. I would say that everything goes back even farther, though, until if you go back with what we had at one time in Europe and, of course, America and the European colonies were Christendom, and this was part of overall Christian countries and so forth, and we had basic Christian values that we live by and our philosophy and so forth. And those have been, systematically drained away and so forth. So that now we don't refer to Christendom anymore. We just talk about the West. And this de-Christianization has been a big part of the humanists and those who don't like the Christian faith in whatever form that the adherents are. They have worked to undermine Christian values, Christian marriage, Christian worship, and so forth to make it largely irrelevant. And as that has happened, of course, then the people have lost their mooring. In Russia, they managed to secure a major triumph in taking over Russia, but of course, as Lenin said, they didn't want Russia. They wanted Germany, but they couldn't get Germany because Germany was too industrialized and too Western with the traditions of culture and so forth that they had, and they got Russia instead, which was still largely a feudal society. But over the time of the communist empire there, the people, of course, became more and more dissatisfied with it. And again, you had the whole concept of you had to toe the party line, think the party thoughts, and so forth, instead of talking about what reality is. And so after the fall of Russia as a Soviet power into a new national power under Yeltsin and then Putin, you have a resurgence of Russian nationalism within the country. You have a resurgence of wanting to be Western, want to have, of course, Western clothes, foodstuffs, and so forth. So you have all of that going on, and of course, a lot of that they're getting this from American and European TV. So that has been not good, because you know how bad our TV is. But the other side of it is that they also have gone back to largely promoting Christianity in the country in the form of Russian Orthodoxy. When I first was going over there in the late 90s, the churches were in disrepair and so forth, and they've largely been rebuilt. The Catholic Cathedral in Moscow has been rebuilt. You can go into even the outside Moscow into the various regions, and the churches have been regilded. But is Russia a Christian country? Well, in Russia, there's about 5% of the people that actually attend services. So they're culturally Christian, or trying to be, and gradually coming back into that realm. So, but as they're going that direction, we're being driven more into anti-Christianity, and not by the people, because that's one of the big reasons why Donald Trump was elected, in my opinion, was because we want a more Christian, stable society. And the Russians are, of course, going that direction, which is counter to the direction that certain groups and leaders and whatnot want to push us. And so, of course, there's the inevitable friction between those two. And I think that is kind of where we are, at this point between America and Russia. But in Russia, I remember even back in the early 2000s and so forth, a lot of Russians said, we're sort of cousins. Why we should be working together. We should be friends and everything. And I agree with that. Russia did have 12 time zones. Now it has 10, of course, because it lost Eastern Europe and Central Asian countries and so forth, but it's still the largest country in the world. But of course, a lot of it is Siberia and so forth. But they are definitely trying to re-Christianize and to protect their cultural heritage and so on.
Well, what amazes me is that the Russian Orthodox Church and Christianity in Russia as a whole, that it was able to survive the whole Soviet era. I mean, it's a testimony, I guess, to the strength that Christianity must have had in that nation at one time for it to have survived the Soviet era the way it did.
Yes, they had, of course, the underground church during the communist era. They had the official church, which Stalin permitted during World War II to begin functioning again, to try and stir up patriotic feelings. And then you had the underground church, which, of course, was not run by government instruments such as the KGB. And that functioned largely underground, from my understanding. And you had the same thing in the Eastern European areas, which had been more Catholic. and the underground church functioned there as well. And so after the fall of communism, they kind of came out of the catacombs, as it were, and began to function and to rebuild again. And I think it's going to be an ongoing process.
Well, you talk about Catholicism, and I want to get back to Russia here in a minute, and then I want to move on to some Confederate things. But you talk about Catholicism, and you are a practicing Roman Catholic, correct?
That's correct.
Yes, sir. Pope Francis. Pat Buchanan wrote an article recently, and of course, you know, when we were kids, the joke, the catchphrase, the one stupid saying we used to say is, well, is the Pope Catholic? I really wonder about Pope Francis.
You're not the only one. There's a a large divide in opinion on that one as to how much or how much Catholic that he actually is. You know, he is a Jesuit as well, and they were really into liberation theology, you know, which was trying to take Marxian practice and philosophy and give it a Christian, at least throw a Christian clothing over it, while, you know, advancing the Marxist goals. And so how heavily he is influenced by all of that, I don't know. But of course, then the Jesuits also tend to have a philosophical approach that's different than a lot of people. You know, they will try and see what one side says, what the other side says, and try to come to a consensus and what the faith requires. And so you have people at odds with that. And of course, you know, just as the Protestant churches were infiltrated under the World Council of Churches and all of these different things to produce the social gospel, you know, a more and more politically correct gospel and all of that sort of thing, so the Catholic Church has been infiltrated. You have that ongoing as well. And of course, the Church, being more monolithic, corrects itself over time because everything is written down, and there's a watchword, a kind of phrase, we're semper idem, always the same. So people will say, well, you know, we changed this, we changed that, we changed something else. But if you actually go back and look at what the Church teaches and everything, that has never been changed. It's just the people, certain people who are wolves in sheep's clothing, I guess we could call them, are promoting and claiming this and claiming that and whatnot, that it really isn't true. And then you have Francis, you know, who wants to have a green world, and, you know, and he's worrying about that, and we should all welcome migrants, which goes counter to any kind of reasoning, as well as the catechism of the Catholic Church itself. So, you know, we have these same influences of humanism and anti-Christianity and so forth, trying to destroy the church, just as it has been working to destroy the other, you know, the Protestants, the Orthodox, and so forth.
I want to come back and talk a little bit more about this, but first, let's have a word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you could subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Pope John Paul II, in one of his last sermons, had said that he believed that his successor would be the Antichrist. And of course, Pope Benedict did not turn out to be the Antichrist. Pope Benedict also turned out to be the only pope that ever resigned from his position rather than dying in it, retired from it. And do you think that it's possible that Pope John Paul saw something afoot within the church, that he knew that he was not going to be around long enough to stop, and he just assumed that his successor was going to be the person that would, I guess, bring it about, and then maybe Pope Benedict, I'm going to guess, was probably picked because at the time he was in poor health and they figured he would be a short-term whatever. And when he actually tried to reform the church and bring it back to its traditional, position. In other words, I guess I'm asking is, as you talked about the Catholic Church being infiltrated, is Pope Francis the culmination of the infiltration?
That's an interesting question. Of course, I don't have the inside knowledge to be able to really answer that, but, he's certainly probably the worst pope that we've ever seen. And according to, different things that have come out of Rome and so forth, there was a cabal that put him in and may have forced the resignation of Pope Benedict, who was certainly a pope in the old tradition who began to reform the church, bring the Mass back. As far as John Paul II goes, he was not that great of a pope, in my opinion. He did a lot of things that were not good on the religious side. On the political side, of course, he worked and helped Poland to gain its freedom from the Soviet Empire, and began to break up of the Soviet Empire. So he did a lot of good, but the other side of it was he did things like took the mark of Shiva on his forehead when he was visiting India, and put when at Sisi he had a meeting with the different all the different religions, and they put their symbols of their religion on a Catholic altar along with the consecrated host of the body, blood, and soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ, which, of course, is a sacrilege. So that's why I say, he's in the material world, he did some good, and the other side, he was not that. And of course, some people, they want to claim mainly a political saint, and rather than a religious one, and he is, there's a lot of problems coming from what he did. But, in some ways, he was somewhat traditional as well. Benedict, of course, is the great pope, and then, we've had great high and number of people coming into the priesthood, had risen exponentially. People going refusing the Novus Ordo new Mass that was put in with Vatican II and wanting to go back to the traditional Latin Mass of the ages among the seminarians and everything, which remains very high. That Benedict has created the grounds for the faith to bloom again truly within the Catholic Church, instead of just being suppressed and derided by the Marxists and so forth within it.
Back to Russia. You sent me an email the other day, and I read some of the article, and then I clicked on the links and I read the articles the email linked to, and I thought that it was interesting. But then last night I was in the car and I was listening to Mark Levine. He's the talk show host who likes to berate and yell at his callers. But he's also a constitutional attorney. He had been, I want to say, Deputy Attorney General under Ed Meese during the Reagan years. I may have his exact job title mistaken there, but he worked in the Reagan administration, worked in the Justice Department. Regardless of what you think of what he says on the radio, he has an impressive resume. He was talking about the same things that were in that article, and talking about how James Brennan in 1976 voted for the communist candidate for president, and that really got my attention. James Brennan, former director of the CIA, potentially recruited in the 1980s by the Soviets, and became essentially a double agent and a Soviet asset working within the CIA, and then under the Obama dictatorship basically becomes the director of the CIA, and now, even in retirement, he's giving the current administration fits.
Yes, it was certainly, in some ways, not surprising given his positions, and that he has taken under the Obama administration and so forth. So, that given that, one wonders, I would like to see, of course, all the proof for what was asserted, but it doesn't surprise me, on the other hand, because many people have said when communism fell in Russia, they all came here and began their same destabilization and working to destroy the American Republic is part of what was going on. And of course, Gus Hall, I remember reading, it was Norman, I can't think of his last name right now, that was the head of used to run as the head of the Communist Party in the elections, stated that Americans would elect a socialist government and embodied all of the principles of it, because they would put it in piece by piece So there was no point in him running as a communist anymore. And so to a large extent, that's true. If you go back and you look in the 50s and when they were having the congressional hearings on all of those things, you can see the progression over time frame in terms of the destruction of morality, the destruction of American culture, the American idea that we, as a nation and so forth, that we're united. And so they're trying to fracture everything so that there is nothing for people to hold on to. And Brennan is in terms of the neocons and so forth, they want a war with Russia to bring it back into line with the New World Order and so forth. And of course, Trump is working to get us out of that. And so to that extent, of course, he needs to talk with other leaders, including Vladimir Putin, to establish, a new idea, new system to replace the one that has collapsed around us.
So do you think that Trump has intentionally took a stab at the New World Order, or do you think that he's just sort of accidentally done so?
That's a good question. Trump is obviously a very intelligent person, so it's hard to underestimate what his reading and research and everything has led him to. And the other side of it, of course, as someone said, he was a winner in the biggest war in New York City, which is the real estate business. And so he had to, work and fight and learn how to win and so on. So he is attuned to the various fights that he gets himself into or people bring to him. And so, and he works to win. He's a winner. And that's what America wants. George Patton said America wants a winner, and that's still true today.
Kind of change the subject a little bit. I probably met you 10 years or so ago, and it was through an organization called CSA Inc. Did you create that organization, or was that something that you inherited, or tell us a little bit about that?
CSA Inc. is basically the actual title is Confederate States of America Incorporated. And it was founded in 1959 in Louisiana by several gentlemen who were interested in protecting Confederate culture, Confederate history, and so on. And to some extent, if you read the charter and whatnot, it was also regarded as a continuation of the Confederate government, which of course never surrendered. After the war, only the Army surrendered. And how much of it carried on from that point, I'm not sure. But at least in 1959, the corporation was formed to be somewhat of a shadow government to perpetuate the Confederate ideas, culture, and history, and so on among the Southern people.
So is that entity still active, or has it sort of fallen apart, or what's happened there?
Well, it's still active. We work with different people and groups and whatnot, basically to do what its purposes were. Again, it's not a big entity, and basically we just promote its work through various historical, by bringing back, say, Jefferson Davis's books and historical articles and whatnot that I have prepared a number of as well for our people to gain a sense of what we actually were. Because the Confederate government, as it was founded and carried on, was basically to be a continuation of the original American Republic, which had been perverted through the Puritans and whatnot in New England, and so that into a federal republic, all-powerful federal republic, rather than a government of the states, so that the whole history of the country was changed under Lincoln to become a monolithic government, which was never what it was before that point.
Do you have any big projects going on with CSA Inc. right now?
We always have some ongoing projects, but until we actually get them completed, I really don't go into that. But the main thing is, we continue to work to promote Southern values, Southern history. The Northern people have just lost the idea of what it was that the South had, what the country had prior to the so-called Civil War, Lincoln's War, whatever you want to call it. And for example, several years ago, I had a lunch with a businesswoman from up north on some other projects, and she was saying, I don't understand why you Southerners are still hanging on to the Confederate ideas and so forth. And I said, well, listen, I said, do you realize we had our own government, we had our own postal system, we had our own roads department, we had our own army, our own Navy, we had everything. And you all came down and took it away from us. And she said, I never thought of it that way. I said, well, you should, because those of us who know history and whatnot, that's what we had. We had a complete country. And so without being anti-United States, there is definitely the position that Confederate history and so forth needs to be held in our memories and our culture among our Southern people, which is being eroded by people from the North largely moving down here and saying, well, that's not how we do it up North, and they want to change everything. The ongoing process, of course, is re-education and to begin developing a fervor for our ancestors, because ultimately those, so-called hateful Confederates and whatnot were our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers, and so on. This is our country, and of course, it's always the victor that writes the history and changes, oppresses the people that had opposed them, and so that has been ongoing for 150 years at this point. But still, there is a deep residue of knowledge within the Southern people that we are different, we are our own. Now, will the American government ever fall apart, and then they allow the Confederate States to rise again? Who knows? History's funny. All countries tend to end after a certain period, and so on. I remember the America of the 50s, and it was a good country, and they certainly not like to see that go away. But the other side of it is, if it must, then we must work to inculcate among our Southern people the ideas and so forth that animated our ancestors.
What brought you originally into interest into your Confederate ancestors, Confederate heritage? What made you a Southern patriot?
Well, I've always known that. So my father told us, about our being in the Southern and so forth. It was just, I don't know, it was in the air back then. And so, the history books in the South were different than the history books in the North. And we moved up north whenever I was young. And so, being from the South, of course, you had to stand up a little more for your heritage and so forth. And so I began to study that. And fortunately for me, whenever I was going into late elementary school, early junior high school, it was the period of the anniversary, 100-year anniversary of the Civil War. And so in the northern schools in Pennsylvania, we sang Dixie, we sang Johnny Come Marching Home, we did all the different, looked up to Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson as being the best generals of the war, and so on. So a lot of that I actually got out of northern schools because it was a time of supposedly reconciliation and recognizing the South had a lot of good on its side. But of course, within the New South idea, well, it was okay, we lost, but we're all one country, and so let's move forward. And so I learned, that was what I had learned. But in this day, and after that time frame, that all began to go away again. Where now they want to demonize the South and demonize our general and demonize all the good things of the South because we dared to oppose the federal government. But that's not what it was that I grew up with. And so does the Confederate States of America, Inc. have a website? We do. It's not an extensive website. It's just a small website. It's just csainc.us.
I think this will be a good place to pause for a word from our sponsor, the American Free Press.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Also, to kind of change the subject again, in your own practice, you sell a lot of supplements. Some of them maybe you've designed yourself. Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the...
Right, we have a lot of supplements. We do homeopathics and so forth. I have a international distance practice that I work with people all over the world with primarily with chronic health problems, and it's for people who want to get beyond where they're at, because you can't drug yourself into health. You have to give your body what it needs to bring itself back into health. And there's a difference in philosophy in that. Now, I am a licensed oriental medical doctor, so I'm an OMD, and so from that standpoint, what we do, I do have a license to do that. But the process is different. We use a different philosophy. I've studied in China. I'm a visiting professor at the Chinese Oriental Medicine University, as well as being a professor in Russia and so forth. But the products we sell are primarily herbal and homeopathic, and they are, again, to state it legally, they are not for the prevention or cure of medical diseases. They are to promote health and to help restore the body back to its normal balance and homeostasis.
Well, I know I'm looking at your website. I'm seeing a few things here, like for one of them is a Nico Stop, which I guess is designed to help people, a homeopathic remedy to help people quit smoking.
Yes, because homeopathy works. The basic philosophy is if something cause a health problem, it will also get rid of it. So, for example, if you take someone with tobacco poisoning symptoms and you give them a homeopathic, which is basically a very minute amount of that, perhaps not, there's not actually any there, but just simply the energy that was originally there from the tobacco, then it will help get rid of the cravings and desire and the symptoms that come from tobacco. And of course, there are other remedies involved with that as well. It's not a single remedy. That particular remedy is not. But that's the idea. Is homeopathy has been around since the late 1700s when it was developed by Samuel Hahnemann in Germany, and it's been very effective. Although the medical practice does not understand really what it is or want to understand it, because it uses very minute amounts of things to stimulate your body back to health.
There's something else on your website that I found interesting. It's called the electronic normalizer. It says it's something that you picked up in Russia.
That is basically feedback. Biofeedback is basically recognized in this country as being a valid non-medical modality. And that's what the electronic normalizer is. It basically pulses as it goes through the system so that the electrical pulses will stimulate the various organs in the body as it goes through and help them regain normal peristalsis and homeostasis and so forth. So it was developed by the Russians, or actually the Soviets, to distinguish from Russia per se now, back in the 50s for the use of the high-ranking members of the Communist Party as they were aging and so forth, to help them regain some of their youth and the ability for normal digestion and bowel movements and so forth. But it is, the Russians claim a lot of different things for it, but we only recognize it here for use as internal biofeedback.
Of course, we could do a whole program just on the different items that you've got on your website there. But is LifeQuestFormulas.com, is that the primary website for people to go to find out about this?
LifeQuestFormulas.com is the website for the health products, yes.
How did you become interested in homeopathic medicine? I mean, of all of the different disciplines that someone could pursue when becoming a physician, how did you decide that this was the path that you were going to follow?
Well, it was a process of education. Whenever I was young, the medical doctor messed my hearing up by a botched tonsillectomy. And so after I became old enough, mainly in high school, I started becoming exposed to various ideas of natural medicine, including homeopathy, and decided that I really wanted to study that. First in hopes that maybe it would do something for the nerve damage that the MDs had caused. But after that, also, it became very evident that it was a viable alternative system of practice to with the standard drug therapy that the MDs use. And then, so I studied it, and we've used it, extensively. I have a very large family, as you know, and many grandchildren, and so we use it with all of them very successfully. And so I might say that just in the family I have an ongoing practice. But, and then, of course, it's sort of specialized in chronic health problems, particularly those that the MDs have given up on, so that to try and work to rebuild the body, because the body can be rebuilt as long as the various organs and glands and whatnot have not been destroyed.
Something that just popped into my mind here, and so I'll ask you about it. I should have asked you about it earlier in the interview. I remember a few years back, you were looking at the possibility of retiring to Belize, and I remember you had told me that you had Confederate ancestors who had migrated to Belize after the war between the states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the large number of Confederate soldiers and families after the war moved to Mexico, moved to Central America, primarily what was British Honduras then, and now Belize, down to Brazil, where they still have the Americana area down there and so forth. And they were there for, after the war until into the 1880s, and there was a massive crop failure and everything all through the Central American area during that time frame, and so they came back after that. But the Confederates, because of the vindictiveness of the Union forces and Reconstruction, what was called Reconstruction, a lot of people tried to get out of that, out of the South, and some moved. Actually, probably many moved into the American West, but others moved down into Central America.
Were you ever able to find? I remember you were in a search down there for your ancestors and the property that they had owned and different things. Were you ever able to conclude those searches or no?
Well, that's still ongoing to an extent. We have found some ancestors, but I'm just interested in genealogy, to find out more of what was going on. Of course, the records in that area are not always the best. So it's still an ongoing process overall. It's a viable area to perhaps retire to because they speak English, and their currency is tied to the U.S. dollar, and it's a peaceful nation, British heritage and all that kind of thing. So it's an interesting idea, and I still kind of entertain that, but I'm so busy with all of the other things I'm doing that I've kind of just put that on the back burner.
So was there anything else that you wanted to talk about during this interview that I didn't ask you about? Any other?
Yeah, it's just the main thing is, as Christ said, or St. Paul said, hold fast to the traditions and that we've been given. And I would say that includes, of course, our religious traditions of being Christians, as well as the heritage and all the good things that we've gotten from our fathers and forefathers, because that's ultimately what's going to bring this country back on track. And I believe that really very strongly that that's what President Trump is working for and trying to achieve, is to get make America great again for Americans, and not just be a place where other people come in and destroy what we have.
That was a really good place to stop our interview with Dr. William Von Peters, so we'll go ahead and let that be the end of this week's TBR Radio Presents of the Dixie Heritage Hour. I hope that our conversation with Dr. Von Peters was enlightening. I hope it was enjoyable. And most importantly, I hope it caused you to think about something that maybe previously you hadn't thought about, or maybe it caused you to think about something in a new way than the way you had previously thought about it. That's really what we try to do here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. We try to make people think. Sadly, we live in a day and an age when people just don't think, and that's what we try to do. We try to kind of force people, encourage people, prompt people to think. We hope at the end of the day that you'll come out thinking like we do, but if that's not achieved, and if you just come out thinking, we've accomplished something. And so I'd also like to encourage you to go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. That website has all kinds of interesting stuff that will, again, inspire thought and thinking. You can get all the back issues of our newsletter by reading that. You can also subscribe to our newsletter. And so by doing that, you will be able to see how you can get the newsletter for free week after week. And you can, all kinds of thought-provoking information. Also, I would like to encourage you to go to Dr. Von Peters' website, lifequestformulas.com. You could spend a lot of time there examining all of the different products and information items that he has available. Also go to csainc.us, the Confederate States of America Incorporated website. It's not as detailed as it had once been, but still there's some interesting reading there as well. We'd also like to encourage you to go to the website of our primary sponsor, the Barnes Review, at barnesreview.org. And there's all kinds of neat information there on the Barnes Review. You can read the blog posts, some of the online articles, and also find out how you could subscribe to what I believe is probably the best historical journal magazine in print today. You'll want to tune in next week for TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I'm not 100% for certain, but I'm relatively certain that our guest next week will be a banker, a lifetime banker, and he's going to be telling us some very interesting things about the banking system, things that perhaps you did not know or realize, and of course some of the things that are coming down the pike as well. And so it'll definitely be worth your time and your energy to tune in next week, so please do so. However you're listening now, be sure to come back to this same place next week on Friday or as soon as you're able, and tune in to next week's episode of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. So until then, from all of us here, God bless, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.